No one ever likes to hear that they are lacking in something. When we get told that we lack in something, it can be discouraging, possibly cause you to feel as though you have something to prove. Sometimes the things we lack are unimportant, but there are some times when the things that are important we do lack. Life will get hard sometimes, and where do we turn to when it gets hard? Our consistent answer must always be God. When obstacles seem impossible, it is vital to remember that you belong to the Lord your God, and with prayer and supplication, He will grant your prayers. In Numbers chapter 13, verses 17 through 29, the Israelites who lost their faith in God, and the Lord commands Moses to send men to spy out the land of Canaan. And when He sends them out, He wants them to return with a sample of the vegetation it provides, and to give a report to Moses and the congregation. Verses 21 through 27. The men Moses sent out to Canaan reported to the people occupying the land how the inhabitants were. Verses 28 through 29. Israel lacked complete faith in God, and they did not receive His blessing and were punished for their lack of faith. So if you could please turn with me to Numbers chapter 13. We're going to start in verses 17. Numbers chapter 13, verses 17. Then Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, Go up this way into the south, and go up to the mountains, and see that the land is like, whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, whether the land that they dwell in is good or bad, whether the cities they inhabit are like camps or strongholds, whether the land is rich or poor, whether there are forests or there not, and be of good courage, and bring some of the fruit of the land that is from there. Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. Now why is that statement important? Well, if it's in season and it's ripe, the land is full of good soil and vegetation. So Moses instructs the men to go into the south part of the mountain to see that the land has what they have is of good soil. And that's verses 17 through 18. Moses also instructed the men to be of good courage and to return with the first fruits of ripe grapes because it was their season. And Moses wanted to know if the land was rich or poor. We must always follow through with a command that God gives us. Right before this, we get a list of the names that the Lord speaks to Moses. This is in verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each of the tribes, their fathers, you shall send a man, every one a leader among them. And from verses 4 all the way through 16, we get a report of the men who are getting sent out over there. And this is where we find two individuals that did not lose their faith of the 13 spies. And the Lord commands Moses to do this. The Lord commands Moses to do this, and Moses obeys. So when Moses gives them instructions, it's important for the men to obey Moses, because when they obey Moses, they're also obeying God. In verses 20, in the middle of the verse, it says, Be of good courage. The spies inspected the land. This is verses 21 through 27. Then the men went up from the wilderness of Zin near the entrance of Hamath, and they cut down a branch with one cluster of the grapes with pomegranates. Let's pick up in verse 21, chapter 13, verses 21. So they went up and spied out the land from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rahab near the entrance of Hamath. And they went up through the south and came near Hebron, Sheshai, and Talmai. And they saw the descendants of Anak were there. Verse 23. Then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and there they cut down a branch with one cluster of the grapes, and they carried it between two of them on a pole. They also brought some of the pomegranates and figs. It's important to realize that in the verse, not just the grapes, pomegranates and figs also implies that the land is good for vegetation. As the men were surveying out the land of Canaan, they were there for 40 days. And that place that they were at was called the Valley of Eshcol. And it was called that because of the cluster of grapes that they cut down at the location. The men chosen as spies did all that Moses commanded them to do, just as the Lord had commanded Moses to do. We must obey God through the word he has given us, keeping his commandments, which shows that we put our faith in him. And when we follow the commandments, we have to realize that when we follow commandments, that shows faith. But it doesn't just show faith just by saying it or stating it. We follow through with it. We're going to go to verses 28. Then the man sent out to Canaan and gave a report. And when the spies saw that the land's inhabitants, they were overwhelmed by fear, because they compared themselves to the descendants of Anak. The descendants of Anak are the giants. The spies saw all the people in the land of Canaan and lost their faith in the Lord and failed to follow through with what God commanded them to do. Verse 29. We must consistently demonstrate courageous faith in our God. Our actions will show if we believe in the Lord or not. Let's pick up in verse 24. This is going to be a reread of the points. The place was called the Valley of Eshcol because the cluster which the men of Israel cut down there had grapes on it. And they returned from spying out the land after 40 days. Now, as they departed and came back to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at the Kadesh, they brought back the word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And then, verse 27, then they told him and said, we went to the land where you sent us, and it truly flows with milk and honey, and this is their fruit. And they showed them the fruit on the branch. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in that land are strong, and the cities are fortified, and they are very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in that land of the south, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea along the banks of the Jordan. And so as they're giving this report, they're kind of telling the congregation, it's pretty big out there. There's a lot of people there, even the giants dwell among them. Verses 30. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let's go up at once and take possession, for we are able to overcome it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against those people, for they are stronger than we are. Verse 32. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out. The land through which they have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, just basically meaning that it's a vast land and the cities in there are kind of small compared to the land. We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. The land through which we have gone through is a land that is, I'm sorry, I lost my place. Let me do that again. This is in the middle of verse 32. And all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. Now, whenever we see the word stature, we like to go back to the book of Luke, and we see the story of Zacchaeus, who was a man of short stature, but a man of great faith. You see, in the New Testament, Zacchaeus was a little man in a sycamore tree, and he comes down, and usually people wait for Jesus to come, but Zacchaeus comes down and goes straight to the Lord. He has great faith. How do we know he has great faith? Well, we know that Zacchaeus had great possessions, and Zacchaeus wasn't owned by his possessions, but he owned his possessions. We know this because whatever he took, he gave back a whole lot more. And he doesn't just say, hey Lord, here I am. Zacchaeus invites him into his house. And the Lord loves Zacchaeus because of his great faith. And even though Zacchaeus was small in stature, he was not small in his faith. But here we see that the children of Israel, the 13 spies, are small in their own eyes. Let's continue in verse 33. There we saw the giants, and this is the spies talking to the congregation. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak, and came from who are fortifying the city. And we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their own sight. God made a promise that he would give the victory to the children of Israel, and preparations were made. How do we know preparations were made? Well, the book of Numbers is a book of war. And in chapter 1, the Lord starts numbering out the tribes. And this is where we get the tribe of Levi. They get separated. They're not going to war. They have to provide for the tabernacle. They have to do Levitical duties. But the rest of the tribes are going out to war. They're getting ready to get the promise that God has said, I'm going to give you this land. But in order for them to get the land, they have to follow through with what God has said. The lack of faith seen in the Israelites showed in their attitudes, and when faced with the obstacles set before them, they were not faithful. We may find ourselves falling short also. So how do we demonstrate our faith when facing the giants in our lives? Do we push through with good courage? Do we trust God entirely? We must always be careful not to let the giants diminish our faith in the Lord, and be of good courage and follow the Lord your God. Caleb was the only man among these spies who stood up and said, let's take that land. We're already promised that land. God is with us. But when we start to look this way or that way, and we see things that are bigger than us in our own sight, sometimes we are disobedient to the Lord your God, to the Lord our God. Be of good courage. Being of good courage doesn't mean go in, act tough, and everything's going to be okay. Being of good courage is sometimes it's just obeying. In the book of Leviticus, we have in chapters. Let's go. I'm going to turn real quick to my notes that I've been taking in school. We have Levitical duties from the tribe of Levi, and the Lord God says, I need you to do this. In every other verse, he ends the verse saying, I am the Lord your God, do this. I am the Lord your God, do this. We do not necessarily obey God to get something in return. We obey God because he is the Lord. Moses understands it, but Moses has to lead 2 million people through the wilderness. This is just after the Exodus, the departure. And it can be a little tough. But God always promises what he says he's going to do. So be of good courage and follow the Lord your God. Be like Caleb. Have a stature like Zacchaeus, and do not be small in your own eyes.